Good evening, brave souls. Tonight we venture into a tale of terror that will grip your heart and haunt your dreams. I had just landed a babysitting job for a couple who lived in a big old house on the outskirts of town. The house was a bit eerie, isolated from the rest of the neighborhood, but the pay was good, and I needed the money. The couple was going out to see a movie that night and left me in charge of their 3 young kids. After getting the kids tucked into bed, I settled down in the living room to watch some TV. It was a quiet night, and I was beginning to relax when the phone suddenly rang. I picked it up, expecting the parents to check in, but instead, I was met with nothing but heavy breathing. Then a man's voice asked, "Have you checked on the children?" My heart skipped a beat. I hung up quickly, telling myself it was probably just someone playing a prank. I tried to shake it off and went back to the TV, but I couldn't help feeling uneasy. About 15 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, when I answered, there was hysterical laughter on the other end. The same voice spoke. "Why haven't you checked on the children?" Panic started to set in. I slammed the phone down and immediately called the police. The operator told me that if the man called again, I should try to keep him on the line long enough for them to trace the call. Not long after, the phone rang a third time. My hand trembled as I picked it up. The heavy breathing was back, followed by the voice. "You should really check on the children." He laughed again, a chilling sound that seemed to echo through the empty house. I tried to stay calm, but I could only manage to keep him on the line for a few seconds before I hung up. The phone rang almost immediately after. This time, it was the police operator, shouting, "Get out of the house right now. The calls are coming from the upstairs phone." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I dropped the phone. At that moment, I heard heavy footsteps descending the stairs. Without thinking, I bolted for the front door, flinging it open just as a hand slammed against the glass behind me. I screamed and ran out into the street, where a police car had just pulled up. The officers rushed inside, and I watched from the street, my breath clouding in the cold night air. Minutes felt like hours, and when they finally came out, one of the officers approached me, his face pale. "You said there were children inside?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I stammered. "I put them to bed upstairs." He exchanged a glance with his partner before turning back to me. "There's no one in there. The house has been empty for years. The family that lived here, they died in a fire 13 years ago." My heart pounded as the officer's words sunk in. "But I saw them. I talked to them." The officer shook his head. "We've got records. A couple and their 3 kids. They burned to death in this house. It's been abandoned ever since." As the reality of what he was saying settled in, I felt the world tilt beneath me. The house, the kids, the calls, they were all echoes of a past tragedy, lingering in that old, cursed house. I backed away, staring at the house that seemed so normal just hours ago. The memory of those small voices, the laughter, the footsteps, they weren't real. Or maybe they were all too real, trapped in a nightmare that never ended, replaying the horror of that night over and over again. The man on the phone had warned me to check on the children, but there were no children left to check on. Not anymore.
I'll never forget the night I met him. I'd been driving for hours, and a cold dread that seemed to grow with each passing mile. Maybe it was the isolation. And then I saw it. A hitchhiker, standing alone on the desolate highway. Hesitantly, I pulled over. The man was tall and thin, with a face that was pale and gaunt. His eyes were dark and hollow, and there was something unsettling about his smile. "Can I give you a lift?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. As he climbed into the car, a cold wave washed over me. The air inside the car seemed to grow heavy, and a strange, musty odor filled the space. We drove in silence for a few minutes. Then the man began to speak. His voice was soft, but it carried a chilling coldness. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said. I forced myself to respond, my voice barely a whisper. "Why not?" He turned to face me, his eyes glowing in the dim light of the car. "Because some things are better left unseen." Before I could react, the car began to slow down. The road ahead seemed to warp and distort, and then we were off the road, tumbling down a steep embankment. The world went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold, hard ground. The car was a mangled wreck a few feet away. I was alone. As I looked around, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the road. It was the hitchhiker, watching me with those same cold, empty eyes.
Cedar Street was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other, where life seemed perfectly ordinary. But that changed one night. A night that would forever mark the Cartwright family and leave a mystery unsolved. Martha and David Cartwright, with their 2 children, Emily and Jake, were a picture-perfect family. They lived in a cozy, ivy-covered house. But on that fateful autumn evening, everything changed. The Cartwrights had gathered in the living room after dinner. Martha folded laundry. David read a book, and the kids played a board game. It was an ordinary night, until the doorbell rang. David opened the door, but no one was there. He stepped outside, searching the shadows, but found nothing. When he returned, an uneasy feeling settled over the house, as if the darkness outside had seeped into their home. Dismissing the feeling, the family decided to head to bed. But David was jolted awake by a strange sound, a soft shuffling, almost like footsteps. David nudged Martha awake, motioning for her to stay quiet. He grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and cautiously made his way downstairs. The living room was empty, and everything appeared normal, but the strange shuffling continued, leading him toward the hallway. As he approached, he heard a whisper, "David." It was Martha's voice, but twisted, unnatural. Fear gripped him as he turned and rushed back upstairs, only to find Martha still in bed, wide awake and terrified. "What's happening?" she asked in a trembling voice. "I don't know," David replied, his voice shaking. "But we need to get the kids and leave." They hurried to the children's rooms, but the kids were nowhere to be found. Panic set in as David and Martha searched the house, their calls for their children growing more desperate with each passing second. Then the whispers returned, echoing through the walls. "David, help us." David and Martha followed the sound, which led them to the living room once more. There, they noticed something they had never seen before, a faint outline of a door on the wall. With trembling hands, David pushed against it, and the door swung open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the basement. The basement was cold and damp, the air thick with a musty odor. The whispers grew louder as they descended the stairs, until they saw Emily and Jake standing in the center of the room, their eyes wide and vacant. "Mama, Daddy." Emily's voice was barely a whisper. "We're scared." David rushed to his children, wrapping his arms around them. But the moment he touched them, the room went silent. The whispers stopped. Martha joined them, pulling Jake into her arms. We're here, she murmured. But something was wrong. The kids felt cold, unnaturally so, and they didn't respond to her touch. Then, in the silence, they heard it, a faint ticking sound, like the ticking of a clock. It grew louder, echoing through the basement until they saw it, a small, old-fashioned clock mounted on the wall, its hands spinning wildly. "David?" Martha's voice trembled with fear. "What's happening?" David didn't have an answer. All he knew was that they had to get out of there. But as they turned to leave, the basement door slammed shut, trapping them in the darkness. The ticking grew louder, pounding in their ears, and the shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around them like a living entity. The whispers returned, but they were different now. Angry, accusing. You didn't save us. You let us die. David's blood ran cold as he recognized the voices. They weren't his children's voices anymore. They were the voices of the dead, of the unsolved crimes that had haunted Cedar Street for years. The shadows closed in, and the last thing David and Martha heard was the sound of their children's laughter, echoing through the darkness as the whispers consumed them. Cedar Street fell silent once more, the Cartwrights vanishing without a trace. The house stood empty, becoming just another ghost story whispered among the townsfolk, a chilling reminder of the shadows that lingered in the neighborhood. But on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers, carried on the wind, calling out for help that will never come. It was a rainy, dull afternoon, the kind that made time crawl. Emily, Jake, and Sarah, three restless friends, sat in Jake's living room, looking for a way to escape their boredom. The rain drummed relentlessly against the windows, and the idea of spending the day doing nothing was unbearable. That's when Jake, always the one for a thrill, brought up the Charlie game. You guys heard of it? Jake asked with a grin. Emily and Sarah shook their heads. Jake explained it was a game meant to communicate with a spirit named Charlie. All they needed was a piece of paper, a pencil, and the nerve to play. It's just a stupid internet thing, Jake said, trying to downplay it. Emily, always the skeptic, shrugged. Why not? It's not like we have anything better to do. Sarah, though more cautious, nodded hesitantly. She didn't like scary stuff, but she didn't want to be left out either. Jake quickly grabbed a piece of paper, drew a cross, and labeled the quadrants yes and no. He balanced the pencil and took a deep breath. Charlie, are you there? The room was silent, the pencil still. Just as Emily was about to scoff, the pencil wobbled, then spun, landing on yes. Sarah gasped, and even Jake's confidence wavered. Emily's smirk faded. That was weird, Emily muttered. Probably just a draft. Jake, his bravado slipping, said, let's ask something else. Charlie, are you a friendly spirit? The pencil moved faster this time, landing decisively on no. The air in the room seemed to thicken. Emily glanced around, feeling a chill. Sarah hugged herself, fear creeping in. Maybe we should stop, Sarah suggested, her voice trembling. Jake forced a laugh. Come on, it's just a game. One more question. Reluctantly, they agreed. Jake asked, Charlie, will something bad happen to us tonight? The pencil spun violently, landing on yes. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The playful mood was gone, replaced by dread. Emily's heart pounded. Jake's grin disappeared. Sarah's face drained of color. This is stupid, Emily said, trying to sound tough. Let's just quit. But before they could move, the pencil spun again, landing on yes once more. A cold draft swept through the room, raising the hair on their necks. Jake, now genuinely scared, asked, Charlie, can we leave the game? The pencil didn't move. The room seemed darker, the shadows deeper. Charlie, can we leave the game? Jake repeated, panic edging his voice. Still, the pencil remained still. The tension was unbearable. Sarah whimpered, and Emily's mind raced for an explanation. Suddenly, the lights flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. A low, sinister laugh echoed around them, sending shivers down their spines. Panic gripped them. Emily fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight with shaking hands. The beam of light revealed their terrified faces, but the paper and pencil had vanished. What did you do, Jake? Sarah cried, terror in her voice. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Jake whispered, backing away. They huddled together, trying to figure out what to do next. The room grew colder, their breath visible in the air. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Emily saw a dark figure standing just beyond the flashlight's reach. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely audible. No answer, just the sound of footsteps approaching. The figure stepped into the light, a shadowy form with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through them. "Leave us alone," Jake shouted, but the figure only laughed, a cold, mocking sound that made their blood run cold. "You shouldn't have called me," the figure hissed. "Now you belong to me." The room seemed to close in on them, warping and twisting as the figure advanced. Emily's heart raced. She grabbed Jake's hand and pulled him toward the door. "Run!" she screamed. They bolted from the room, the figure's laughter echoing behind them. The house felt endless, trapping them in a nightmare. The figure was always behind them, a shadow that wouldn't let them go. Finally, they burst out the front door into the rain-soaked night. They didn't stop running. They didn't know where they were going, only that they had to get away. But deep down, they knew the truth. No matter how far they ran, they would never truly escape. Charlie was with them now, a shadow that would follow them forever. On the outskirts of town, there was a forgotten building, once a grand hotel. The years had not been kind, and now it stood empty, its windows shattered and walls crumbling. Yet, despite its decay, one room remained untouched by time, room 213. Legend had it that anyone who entered that room was never seen again. Sam and his friends, curious and craving adventure, decided to visit the hotel. They had heard the stories, but dismissed them as silly rumors. They were teenagers, too old to believe in ghost stories, but still young enough to feel a thrill at the thought of exploring the unknown. The sun was setting as they arrived at the hotel. The building loomed before them, its shadow stretching across the cracked pavement. They pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned under their weight. "Let's find room 213, Sam said, his voice steady but his heart racing. His friends nodded, and they made their way through the dark, empty hallways. The hotel seemed to stretch on forever. Each door they passed marked with a number that grew increasingly higher. Finally, they stood before the door to room 213. The door was different from the others, intact and oddly clean, as if it had been preserved by something other than time. Sam hesitated for a moment, then turned the knob. The door swung open without a sound. Inside, the room was pristine. A large bed stood against one wall, its sheets crisp and white. A window overlooked the town, the view as clear as it had been decades ago. But something felt wrong. The air in the room was too still, too quiet. It was as if the room was waiting for something or someone. "Let's go in," Sam said, but his friends hung back. They felt it too. The eerie stillness, the unnatural silence. But Sam, determined to prove his bravery, stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind him. Sam turned, his heart pounding. He tried the knob, but it wouldn't budge. He banged on the door, calling for his friends, but they didn't answer. He was alone. He spun around, his eyes scanning the room. Everything was the same, yet somehow different. The air was colder now, and the light from the window had dimmed. The bed, once inviting, now seemed menacing, its shadow stretching across the floor like grasping hands. Suddenly, the room began to change. The walls seemed to pulse, the floor shifting beneath his feet. The window showed not the town, but a swirling darkness, a void that seemed to beckon him closer. Sam backed away, his fear growing with each step. He reached the bed and saw something that made his blood run cold. There, etched into the headboard, were the names of those who had come before him. Each name was followed by a date, the date they had entered the room, and a blank space where the date of their departure should have been. His name was there too, freshly carved. Panic set in. Sam ran to the door, pounding on it with all his strength. "Let me out," he screamed. But his voice was swallowed by the room. The walls closed in around him, the darkness from the window seeping into the corners of the room. And then he heard it, a whisper, faint but clear. "Join us," it said, the voice echoing in his mind. "Stay with us forever." Sam spun around, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing, only the empty room and the darkness that now filled it. He felt a cold hand on his shoulder and screamed. Outside, his friends finally managed to open the door. They rushed inside, but the room was empty. Sam was gone, and all that remained was the echo of his last terrified scream. They never spoke of what happened, but they knew the truth. Room 213 was cursed, a place where time stood still, and once you entered, you never left. The hotel was abandoned for good after that, left to crumble into dust. But some say that if you listen closely at night, you can still hear the whispers of those trapped inside, calling out for someone, anyone, to join them. And the door to room 213 remains shut, waiting for its next victim. It was nearing midnight when John found himself driving down Highway 37, a stretch of road he had been avoiding for years. The long, dark road snaked through endless miles of forest, its bends hidden by towering trees. The highway had a reputation, and not a good one. Rumors about strange disappearances and ghostly apparitions had kept locals off it for decades. But John had no choice. His daughter, Emily, had been in an accident and he needed to get to her. The rain had started about an hour ago, turning the highway into a slick, dangerous path. His windshield wipers slapped back and forth, but the heavy downpour made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. He squinted at the road, gripping the steering wheel tighter as his headlights illuminated only the road's immediate edge before being swallowed by the darkness. "Just focus. You'll be there soon," John muttered to himself, trying to shake the growing unease gnawing at him. He flicked the radio on for some company, but static filled the car. No signal, of course. Just as he was about to turn it off, a voice crackled through. "Turn around." A deep, distorted voice whispered from the static. John's hand froze on the knob. His heart pounded, the hairs on his arms standing up. He switched the radio off, his fingers trembling. He told himself it was just a fluke, maybe interference from the storm. The highway was empty, save for his car, and John was starting to regret taking this route. His GPS had rerouted him when a landslide blocked the main highway, and Highway 37 had been his only option. Now, as he drove deeper into the isolated forest, the feeling of being watched settled over him. Suddenly, his headlights flickered. Then they blinked off for a split second before coming back. John's heart skipped a beat. He checked his fuel gauge, full tank. Everything seemed normal, but the unsettling feeling wouldn't go away. He pushed the car a little faster, wanting to get off this cursed road. As he rounded a bend, John's headlights caught something on the side of the road. A figure, tall, gaunt, and cloaked in shadow, stood motionless by the highway's edge. John slammed the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. His heart pounded in his ears as he stared at the figure, its face obscured by the hood of a ragged cloak. "What the hell?" he whispered, trying to get a better look through the rain-soaked windshield. The figure remained perfectly still, almost as if it had been waiting for him. John's pulse quickened. It was too far out in the middle of nowhere for anyone to be standing on the side of the road like that. With his breath caught in his throat, he pressed on the gas and sped past the figure. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but the figure had disappeared into the rain. His hands shook on the wheel as the road stretched endlessly ahead of him. He needed to get to Emily, but the miles were passing too slowly. 20 minutes later, John thought he could relax. Maybe the figure had just been a trick of the rain or his overactive imagination. Then, out of nowhere, a loud thump echoed from the roof of his car. John nearly lost control, swerving to the side of the highway before he brought the car to a stop. His breath came in short, rapid gasps. Something, or someone, was on the roof. He sat in silence for a moment, frozen in place. The rain continued to pound the car, but beneath it, he could hear the slow, deliberate scrape of something dragging across the metal roof. "This can't be happening," John muttered, fumbling for his phone. No service. Suddenly, the car rocked, as if something heavy had jumped off the roof. John's heart was racing, his eyes darting around the darkness outside. He reached for the door handle, but something deep inside him screamed not to open it. His hands were slick with sweat. His breathing labored as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. Through the rain, something moved, a shadow darting between the trees at the edge of the highway. John's heart leaped into his throat. The figure was back, its hood still drawn low, its movements unnaturally fast. John floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning briefly on the wet road before gaining traction. The car sped down the highway, and the trees blurred by. He didn't care about the speed anymore. He just needed to get out. The road ahead stretched into darkness, endless and consuming. John checked the mirror again. The figure was gone. Relief washed over him, but only for a moment. Without warning, the figure appeared in the middle of the road, directly in his path. John screamed, slamming on the brakes. The tires squealed, and the car swerved violently, narrowly missing the figure. He fought the wheel, pulling the car back under control. His hands ached from the grip he had on the wheel. John pulled over, his chest heaving. His mind raced. Was it all in his head, or was the figure somehow real, haunting him as he sped down the highway? The rain continued to pound the roof, relentless. John stared out into the night, the forest around him eerily still. He couldn't stay here. His phone still had no signal, and the gas station he remembered seeing on the GPS was miles ahead. But he wasn't alone on this highway, and the thought made his skin crawl. As he pulled back onto the road, the figure stood at the edge of the trees, watching him, waiting. John didn't slow down. He pressed the pedal harder, pushing the car faster than he ever had before. He kept his eyes on the road, refusing to look in the rearview mirror again. A mile later, the flickering glow of a gas station's neon sign appeared through the rain. John's heart leaped. Civilization, finally. He pulled into the lot, his tires squealing on the wet pavement. He leaped out of the car, drenched by the rain, as he ran into the station's small shop. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a stark contrast to the eerie darkness outside. The clerk, a tired-looking man in his 50s, glanced up from his magazine. "Everything okay, buddy?" John leaned on the counter, still trying to catch his breath. There's someone out there on the highway." The clerk raised an eyebrow. "You took Highway 37, didn't you?" John nodded, wiping the rain from his face. The clerk sighed and stood, gesturing toward the road. "People say there's something wrong with that highway. Folks disappear, see things that aren't there. Best to keep moving." John stared out into the night. the rain-soaked highway glistening under the station's lights. The figure was gone, but in the pit of his stomach, John knew he wasn't safe yet. He filled his tank, not daring to look back at the road. As he drove off, leaving the gas station and the cursed highway behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. The road was clear now, but in the shadows of the forest, something unseen still lurked, waiting for the next traveler foolish enough to pass through. He only hoped he'd make it to Emily before it caught him.